Throughout the 4,000-year-long era of agrarian civilizations, few human communities existed in isolation. As various groups of pastoralists, complex states, and large-scale agrarian civilizations expanded their boundaries, they joined together to become smaller parts of much larger systems. Sometimes they joined up simply because their borders met and merged along contested military frontiers, such as that between the Romans and Parthians, or the Han Dynasty and Xiongnu. But more often they came together in a looser sense as people from one region traded with or traveled into other regions beyond the boundaries of their own civilization. This regular commingling meant that any attempt to consider agrarian civilizations as discrete entities contained between the sort of modern borders we see on maps just doesn't work, because the borders between different civilizations were really just vague regions where the control of imperial leaders was regularly contested by the claims of local rulers. These processes are complex, and the borders between civilizations were always fluid. But from the big history perspective, the gradual linking up of different civilizations was immensely important, because it led to a huge increase in the size, diversity, and intensity of opportunities for collective learning, a capacity that, as we've seen, appears to be unique to human beings. Ever since the Paleolithic era of human history, the exchange of ideas between diverse peoples and cultures has been a prime mover in promoting historical change through enhanced collective learning. But during the Paleolithic and subsequent early agrarian eras, exchanges were limited by the small size of the groups involved. Only when exchanges began to dramatically expand in scope during the era of agrarian civilizations do we start to see a significant impact on collective learning. In Afro-Eurasia, as more and more agrarian civilizations became involved in trans-regional exchanges and enhanced collective learning, huge changes in the material, artistic, social, and spiritual domains of human history began to occur. Eventually, within the vast Afro-Eurasian world zone in particular, pretty well every single human community was connected together in a vast exchange web. Actually, this was true within all four of the world zones, although hardly at all between them. Material and non-material exchanges developed within Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, Australasia, and the Pacific. But these zones were so isolated from each other until roughly 1500 of the Common Era that human populations in each remained utterly ignorant of events in the others. Our focus here remains within Afro-Eurasia, particularly on the most influential of all the pre-modern exchange networks which emerged along the Silk Roads. The trans-civilizational contacts that occurred through Silk Roads exchanges resulted in the most significant collective learning so far experienced by the human species. The term Silk Roads is a relatively new one, not a label that ancient peoples would have used at all. It comes from the German term Die Seidenstraße, which was coined by the late 19th century German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen. He initially used it in the singular form, imagining a single trade route linking China and the Mediterranean world through Central Asia. Now we know that was never a single road, but rather a network of shifting paths, often dictated by environmental or political factors. So the plural form of the phrase, Die Seidenstraßen, or the Silk Roads, is much more accurate. The first important period of the Silk Roads was between roughly 50 BCE and 250 CE, when exchanges took place between the Chinese, Indian, Kushan, Iranian, steppe nomadic, and Mediterranean worlds. The demise of the Western Roman, Parthian, Kushan, and Han Chinese empires resulted in several centuries of less regular contact, but a second Silk Roads era subsequently operated for several centuries between roughly 600 and 1000 CE, connecting China, India, Southeast Asia, and the realm of Islam, and the Byzantine Empire into another vast web based on overland and maritime trade. The primary function of the Silk Roads during both periods was to facilitate trade in material commodities, of course. But intellectual, social, and artistic ideas also traveled with the merchants, and these had an even greater impact on collective learning. An early example of intellectual exchange, which took place before the Silk Roads had started to operate with real intensity, was something we have already considered: the spread of Greek and Hellenistic culture from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central Asia and India. This occurred because Greek merchants and the colonists following in the footsteps of Alexander spread Greek language, art, religion, philosophy, and law throughout much of the region. But the spread of ideas via the Silk Roads began primarily as a result of long-distance trade. Commercial and cultural exchange on the scale of Silk Roads trade became possible only after the small river valley states of the early agrarian era had been consolidated into substantial agrarian civilizations, a process that, as we have seen, was largely the result of warfare. Continuing expansion by the major civilizations meant that by the first Silk Roads era, just 4 imperial dynasties, those of the Roman, Parthian, Kushan, and Han empires, controlled much of the Eurasian landmass from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The consolidation of these huge states established order and stability over a vast and previously fragmented geopolitical environment. Internal road networks were constructed, advances made in metallurgy and transport technology, agricultural production was intensified, and coinage appeared for the first time. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, conditions in Afro-Eurasia were ripe for levels of material and cultural exchange and collective learning hitherto unknown. Also critical in facilitating these exchanges were the pastoral nomads, who, as we have seen, formed communities that lived primarily from the exploitation of domestic animals. By the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, several large pastoral nomadic communities had emerged with the ability to prosper in the harsh interior of Afro-Eurasia, and they served as the first tenuous links among the different communities along the Silk Roads and other networks. Once these preconditions were in place, it was the decision by the Han Chinese to begin to interact with their Western neighbors and engage in long-distance commerce that turned regional trading activity into a great trans-Afro-Eurasian network. The Han became involved after Emperor Wudi dispatched envoy Zhang Qian on a diplomatic and exploratory mission into Central Asia. When Zhang Qian returned after an epic journey of 12 years, he convinced the emperor that friendly relations could be established with many of the states of Central Asia because they were, quote, hungry for Han goods. Those that weren't eager to trade could be subdued by force and compelled to join the Han trade and tributary network. Within a decade, the Han had indeed established a tributary relationship with dozens of city-states of Central Asia, and mercantile traffic began to flow out of China along the ancient migration routes into Central Asia. Half a century after the Han began to engage with their Western neighbors, Augustus came to power in Rome following a century of civil war. This restored peace and stability to much of Western Afro-Eurasia, leading to a sharp increase in the demand for luxury goods in Rome, particularly for spices and exotic textiles like silk. As the name of this trading network suggests, the major Chinese export commodity in demand in Rome was indeed silk, an elegant, translucent, sensual material that easily took vivid natural dyes and came to be regarded as the last word in fashion by patrician women. The Chinese, realizing the commercial value of their monopoly on silk, carefully guarded the secrets of silk production, and border guards searched merchants to make sure they weren't carrying any actual silkworms out of the country. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this and suggest that silk was completely unknown outside of China. Even the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle mentions it. But the Chinese were apparently the masters of high-volume, high-quality silk production, and as the market for the fabric increased in Rome, it was the Chinese who were able to supply that demand. Many splendid images of elite women and goddesses adorned in silk have been found on the walls of villas in Pompeii, preserved by the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. These gorgeous silk garments are depicted as thin and translucent, vividly colored by the use of the best natural dyes, and often decorated with the transverse stripes of gold. The sensual nature of the fabric was a source of inspiration to many Roman poets, including Augustan Golden Age writers like Tibullus, Propertius, Horace, and Ovid. Here is Sextus Propertius in the Love Elegies. What need is there, mia vita, to come with your hair adorned and slither about in a thin silk dress? Seneca the Younger displays what became something of a moral horror amongst more conservative Romans at the nature of the garments Roman women were wearing in public, including married women. Let me quote Seneca: "I can see clothes of silk if materials that do not hide the body nor even one's decency can be called clothes. Wretched flocks of maidens labor so that the adulteress may be visible through her thin dress, so that her husband has no more acquaintance than any outsider or foreigner with his wife's body." Other imports into the Roman Empire from China, Central Asia, Arabia, and India included superb Han iron and nutmeg, cloves, cardamom, and pepper, prized as condiments, but also as aphrodisiacs, anesthetics, and perfumes. Importing these high-value goods cost the Romans a fortune. In 65 CE, Roman Senator Pliny the Elder wrote that trade with Asia was draining the treasury of some 100 million sestertii, something like $1 billion every year. Now, Pliny may have been exaggerating the dangers of Rome's imports. In fact, he would also have been acutely aware of a substantial volume of Roman exports to China, indicating the incredible scale of Silk Road's commercial exchanges. In return for their high-value exports, the Chinese imported a range of agricultural products, including grapes, Roman glassware, art objects from India and Egypt, and horses from the steppes. Traveling the Silk Roads could be challenging, but given the amount of money involved, and therefore the profits to be made by merchants, it's not surprising that so many traders were willing to risk the physical rigors of the journey. The route from China left the early Han capital of Chang'an and headed through the Gansu corridor between Mongolia's Gobi Desert and the Tibetan Plateau to Dunhuang. From there, traders chose a route that went either south or north of the forbidding Taklamakan Desert, using oasis towns for supplies and rest. These two routes met again at Kashgar in far western Xinjiang province today, then went up and across the Pamir Mountains, heading towards the major Central Asian trading cities of Bactra, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv. Or alternatively, south, following the route of the modern Karakoram Highway down into the Indus Valley. At each of the oasis towns along the land routes, traders stayed in what later became known as a caravanserai, a Persian compound word describing a home or shelter for caravans. Caravan means a group of travelers on a long journey, and sarai means a building with an enclosed courtyard. These were roadside inns where travelers could rest and recover from the day's journey, the precursors of the modern motel that has become so ubiquitous around the world. Caravanserais were sturdily built, typically large single buildings with a square-walled exterior and a single portal wide enough to permit large or heavily laden beasts such as camels to enter. The courtyard would be open to the sky, and along the inside walls were stalls or chambers to accommodate merchants and their servants, their animals, and their merchandise. Here the traders and their animals would rest and recover from the rigors of the day before setting out next morning on a new stage of the journey. This is the infrastructure that made the Silk Roads possible. I like to imagine the atmosphere in a caravanserai, the babble of different languages, the discussions around the campfires on everything from the condition of the mountain passes to the price of silk or pepper to the different ideological beliefs of the merchants. Is this where Confucianism and Taoism first met Buddhism, or where Nestorian Christianity first met Hinduism? These inns made possible not only the transmission of huge quantities of valuable goods, but also the exchange of the great ideas of ancient civilizations: Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and Chinese. The animal that made Silk Roads trade possible in the eastern and central regions was the Bactrian camel. Native to the steppes of Central Asia, the two-humped Bactrian camel is a prime example of evolutionary adaptation to a specific environment. To survive the harsh winters, the camel grows a long, shaggy coat, which it sheds rapidly as the season warms up. The two humps on its back are composed of fat, on which it can survive for sustained periods, and its long eyelashes and sealable nostrils help to keep out dust in the region's frequent sandstorms. The two broad toes on each of its feet are able to spread widely as an adaptation to walking on sand. The bulk of overland Silk Roads trade was literally carried on the backs of these extraordinary animals. Exports from the Mediterranean region typically followed somewhat different routes to reach the Far East. Significant information on the geography of the western routes of the Silk Roads has come to us from a document produced early in the 1st century CE, Parthian Stations, written by a Parthian Greek merchant Isidorus of Charax. From the Mediterranean, the major Silk Road's land routes passed through the great trading cities of Roman Syria, such as Antioch, crossed the harsh deserts via caravanserais and the trading cities of Palmyra and Ctesiphon before reaching Seleucia on the Tigris River. From here, this route climbed through the rugged Zagros Mountains, heading east to the city of Ecbatana and eventually towards Merv beyond the Iranian plateau. From Merv, the main route turned north via Bukhara and the Fergana Valley and then east into Mongolia before dropping down south towards Han, China. Around the time Parthian stations was being composed, the amount of trans-Afro-Eurasian trade taking place by sea was also increasing, particularly between Roman Egypt and the coast of India. The survival of a 1st century CE mariner's handbook, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, provides historians with a fascinating account of maritime commerce at that time. The Periplus demonstrates that sailors had discovered the secrets of the monsoon trade winds. The winds blow reliably from the southwest in the summer, allowing heavily laden trade ships to sail across the Indian Ocean from the coast of Africa to India. In the winter, the winds reverse and the same ships carrying new cargo could make the return journey back to the Red Sea. Whether by land or by sea, however, no traders we are aware of ever made their way along the entire length of the Silk Roads. Instead, merchants from the major Eastern and Western civilizations took their goods so far, then passed them on to a series of middlemen, including traders who were operating deep within the Kushan Empire, which extended across most of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Kushan Empire, which can be dated from roughly 45 to 225 of the Common Era, is one of the most important yet least known agrarian civilizations in world history. Located at the heart of the Silk Road's network, it straddled and influenced both the land and maritime routes. Descended from pastoral nomads, the Kushans maintained relatively cordial relations with the Romans, Parthians, Chinese, Indians, and the steppe nomads, and were thus able to play a crucial role in facilitating the extraordinary levels of cross-cultural exchange that characterized the first Silk Road's era. The Kushan monarchs were not only effective political and military rulers, they also demonstrated a remarkable appreciation of art and were patrons of innovative sculpture workshops within their empire. The output from these workshops reflects the sort of synthesis typical of the intensity of collective learning during the era. The sculptures produced in the Kushan cities of Gandhara and Mathura were created by the combined talents of Central Asian, Indian, and Hellenistic Greek artists. It was apparently they who were commissioned to create the first images of the Buddha for worship. Until this first Silk Road's era, the Buddha had never been depicted in human form, but had instead been represented by symbols including an umbrella or footprints. The first representation of the Buddha was created in Gandhara and was influenced by depictions of Greco-Roman deities. This physical representation then spread along the Silk Roads to Sri Lanka, to China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. The spread of Buddhist ideology itself along the trade routes is an equally striking example of this cross-fertilization of traditions. Buddhism emerged in northern India in the 6th century BCE, and 800 years later, according to ancient Chinese sources, the Kushan king Kanishka the Great, who reigned probably from 129 to 152 CE, may have convened an important meeting in Kashmir at which the decision was taken to rewrite the Buddhist scriptures in a more popular and accessible language. Now, whether this gathering actually occurred or is just an example of a broader process, the rewriting of Buddhist documents in a language that common people could understand and not one that could be read only by religious elites helped facilitate the emergence and spread of an especially popular form of Buddhism known as Mahayana, or Great Vehicle Buddhism. Offering the hope of salvation to all, regardless of caste or status, Buddhist ideas then spread along the well-traveled trade routes from India through the Kushan realm and into China, because, like their Indian counterparts, Chinese merchants active in the silk trade became attracted to the faith and returned home to spread its message. Chinese edicts of 65 and 70 CE specifically mention the spread of Buddhism and opposition to it from imperial scholars devoted to Confucianism. By the late 4th century, a period of disunity in China, much of the population of northern China had adopted Buddhism, and by the 6th century, much of southern China had adopted it as well. The religion also found ready acceptance in Korea, Japan, Tibet, Mongolia, and Southeast Asia. The Silk Roads also facilitated the spread of Christianity, Manichaeism, and later Islam. Christian missionaries made good use of the superb road and sea transportation networks. As we have seen, the Christian missionary Paul of Tarsus traveled 8,000 miles along the roads and sea lanes of the Eastern Roman Empire, preaching to small Christian communities. Christianity eventually spread further to the east along the Silk Roads through Mesopotamia and Iran into India and eventually into China. But it was the Nestorian branch of Christianity, regarded as heretical by the traditional church, that became most deeply entrenched in the Central and Eastern Asia. Nestorianism held that Jesus existed as two beings, the man Jesus on the one hand and God's divine Son on the other. The Central Asian religion of Manichaeism, which viewed the world in dualistic terms such as spirit and matter, good and evil, also benefited from the Silk Roads after it emerged in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century CE. Its founder, Mani, was a fervent missionary who traveled extensively and also dispatched disciples. Like Buddhism, Manichaeism was particularly attractive to merchants, and eventually most of the major Silk Roads trading cities contained Manichaean communities. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Silk Roads fell gradually into decline as both China and the Roman Empire withdrew from the network. Silk Roads trade itself was at least partly responsible for this disengagement because it contributed to the spread of disastrous epidemic diseases. Smallpox, measles, and bubonic plagues devastated the populations at either end of the routes where people had less resistance. The population of the Roman Empire may have fallen from 60 million to 45 million between the mid-1st and mid-2nd centuries of the Common Era. As epidemics continued to ravage Eurasian urban centers in the centuries that followed, populations declined again to perhaps 40 million in the Mediterranean region by 400 CE and 45 million in China by 600 CE. Not only did the passing of disease bacteria along the Silk Roads by traders play a significant role in the depopulation and subsequent decline of both the Han and Roman empires, but the exposure of millions of humans to these pathogens meant that antibodies spread extensively throughout the Afro-Eurasian world zone, and important immunities were built up within populations. These immunities proved of great significance in the pre-modern age, when Muslim, Chinese, and particularly European traders and explorers carried Afro-Eurasian diseases to the other world zones with disastrous consequences for native populations. The Han Dynasty disintegrated in 220 CE, the Kushan and Parthian empires collapsed under pressure from Sasanian invaders a few decades later, and the Roman Empire experienced a series of crises throughout the first half of the 3rd century. For the next several centuries, the prevailing political situation in many parts of Afro-Eurasia was not conducive to large-scale commercial exchange. However, with the creation of the vast realm of Islam in the 8th and 9th centuries and the establishment of the Tang Dynasty in China at the same time, significant Silk Roads exchanges along both land and maritime routes revived. This period is known as the Second Silk Roads era. Both the Tang Dynasty and its successor, the Song Dynasty, which ruled well into the 13th century, presided over a vibrant market economy in China in which agricultural and manufacturing specialization, population growth, urbanization, and infrastructure development led to high levels of internal and external trade. New financial instruments, including printed paper money, appeared to facilitate large-scale mercantile activity. At the same time, Arab merchants, benefiting from the stable and prosperous Abbasid administration in Baghdad, began to engage with Chinese merchants in lucrative commercial enterprises. Large numbers of Muslim merchants actually moved to China, where they joined communities of Byzantine, Indian, and Southeast Asian traders in the great Chinese port cities. As maritime trade gradually eclipsed overland trade in volume, merchants and sailors from all over Afro-Eurasia flocked to southern port cities like Guangzhou. The recent discovery in the waters of Indonesia of a sunken 9th century CE Arab ship or dhow, the so-called Belitung wreck, has provided historians with evidence of both the intensity of Chinese Muslim trade and the significance of maritime routes in facilitating it. The dhow was filled with tens of thousands of carefully packaged Tang ceramic plates and bowls, along with many gold and silver objects. The Tang bowls were evidently intended for the 9th century equivalent of a mass market consumption. The bowls were made with cobalt for blue coloring, which was imported by the Chinese manufacturers in significant quantities from Iran. The firing date of the bowls was carefully noted in the ship's manifest. The cargo also included large quantities of standardized ink pots, spice jars, and jugs, export goods manufactured for specific markets. Decorative patterns painted or glazed on the various items, including Buddhist, Iranian, and Islamic motifs, show the specific markets the goods were heading to, all evidence of the vibrant nature of maritime trade in the first millennium of the Common Era. As with the First Silk Road's era, although the material exchanges were important and impressive, the cultural exchanges in this later period seem, in retrospect, of even greater significance. Long before the Tang came to power, many foreign religions had made their way into East Asia. With the advent of Islam and the establishment of substantial Muslim merchant communities in the centuries that followed, mosques also began to appear in many Chinese cities. Yet of all the foreign beliefs that were accepted in China, only Buddhism made substantial inroads against Confucianism. Between 600 and 1000 CE, thousands of Buddhist stupas and temples were constructed in China. With its promise of salvation, Buddhism seriously challenged Taoism and Confucianism for the hearts and minds of many Chinese. And in the end, the syncretic version of Chan Buddhism, or Zen Buddhism in Japan, emerged as a popular compromise. Buddhism remains one of the great cultural bonds shared by millions of Asian people, one of the many legacies that the modern world owes to the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads remind us of the value of studying history with both a micro and a macro level lens. We need the big history perspective to really appreciate the global significance of these exchanges. But we can only tell the big history of the Silk Roads because of the work of so many brilliant specialists in languages, art, coins, and archaeology. The Silk Roads then, both the land and maritime routes, provided vital and transformative interconnectedness among civilizations during the era of agrarian civilizations. Along these difficult routes through some of the harshest geography on Earth traveled merchants and adventurers, diplomats and missionaries, each carrying their commodities and ideas enormous distances across Eurasia. As a result of this interaction, despite the diversity of participants, the history of Afro-Eurasia has preserved a certain underlying unity expressed in common technologies, artistic styles, cultures and religions, even disease and immunity patterns. A unity that was to have profound implications for subsequent world history. The physical contexts that made the Silk Roads possible were the product of billions of years of geological change and biological evolution. Geography made it possible for the first civilizations of Western Eurasia and Northeastern Africa to form cultural and commercial connections. But geography also prevented Chinese civilization from joining these networks in any substantive way. Only with the human domestication of the silkworm and the Bactrian camel did the Chinese have an export commodity valuable enough and a transport mechanism hardy enough to facilitate the expensive and complex expeditions necessary to allow Chinese merchants to join the pre-existing exchange networks. This joining together of previously separated human communities led to a steep increase in levels of collective learning and complexity that had global ramifications. The commingling of so many goods, ideas, and diseases around a geographical hub located deep in central Eurasia was the catalyst for an extraordinary increase in the complexity of human relationships and collective learning, a complexity that drove our species inexorably along a path towards the modern revolution.